Good morning. My name is Peter Schlegel, and it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Eli Adashi. Dr. Adashi is an academic physician executive and former Dean of Medicine and Biological Sciences at Brown University. He is an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine and has been mentor to over 50 postdoctoral trainees and fellows. He's the author or co-author of over 450 peer-reviewed manuscripts and 120 book chapters and reviews in the general areas of reproduction, science, law, ethics, and human rights. Dr. Adashi's work has been referenced in the New York Times, Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the Huffington Post, and several other media outlets. He's been a recipient of continuous NIH funding from 1985 to 2005, inclusive of a Research Career Development Award. Amongst a slew of other national and international recognitions, he has also received the inaugural Lifetime Contribution Award from the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. This presentation is supported by a gift from the Howard and Georgiana Foundation. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Adashi to give his talk entitled The Past and Future of IVF. Ellie.
Thank you very kindly, Professor Schlegel. Good morning, everybody. Mr. President, members of the Society, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to attempt to discuss today the past and future of IVF. The past is clear, but the future could be interpreted in a number of ways, and I doubtedly will put my own personal stamp on it, but will acknowledge right now that there are doubtlessly many other ways to look at that issue. The past of IVF in the United States is obviously all about the 40th anniversary of the birth of Elizabeth Jordan Carr, the first American IVF baby who graced virtually every American outlet at the time, from the Boston Globe to Life magazine. But the story really begins in 1965, when a young Bob Edwards joined Drs. Howard and Georgiana Jones at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine with an eye towards securing human oocytes, culturing them, maturing them, and fertilizing them in vitro, something that at that point in time had yet to be accomplished. The oocyte source was resected ovarian wedges that were derived from polycystic ovary patients who underwent ovarian wedge resection. At the conclusion of this joint effort of Dr. Edwards and Drs. Howard and Georgiana Jones, a paper was published in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. The main conclusions of that paper were on the negative side. The authors felt that they did not truly accomplish their intended goal. However, a retrospective analysis of some of the images and some of the criteria used to determine fertilization may suggest that the authors may, in fact, have been successful back then, and that the first ever human oocyte to be fertilized in vitro may in fact have been accomplished in Baltimore, Maryland, back in 1965. On July 1st, 1978, after 35 years of service, Drs. Howard and Georgiana Jones announced their retirement from Johns Hopkins University and their intent to relocate to Norfolk, Virginia. However, something happened on the way to Norfolk, and that something happened on July the 25th, 1978, and that, of course, was the birth of Louise Joy Brown, shown here in the arms of her mother, Leslie. That, of course, changed everything. The following clip describes, from the Joneses' point of view, what that meant to their future direction and where the program was going to go from there.
And then we came to Norfolk.
And that happened to be the birthday of Louise Brown.
The story captured the world's headlines, and the Joneses had a link with the British team of Patrick Steptoe and Robert Edwards. Edwards had worked with them at Baltimore. A Norfolk reporter wanted to talk about it.
She came to our home as the man was moving in the boxes and the furniture, and we had an interview sitting on the boxes. And as she finished the interview, she asked us, could this be done in Norfolk? And we thought it was almost a joke, and we said, why, certainly. And she said, what would it take? And we said, a little money.
What happened?
A most extraordinary thing. Georgiana had had a patient from Norfolk who had come to Baltimore with infertility. She was fortunate to have a child subsequent to that, and she called up Georgiana.
She said, Dr. Jones, I understand that Dr. Howard says that it will only take a little bit of money to bring a test tube baby clinic to Norfolk. And my family has a foundation which we would love to donate.
Well, with money out of the way, job number 2 was the construction of a team. The team included Dr. Mason Andrews, then professor and chair of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the Eastern Virginia Medical School, and the future obstetrician of Judy Carr. Dr. Jairo Garcia, a former trainee of Drs. Howard and Georgiana Jones, who joined the team from Columbia. Dr. Howard Jones, Dr. Georgiana Seeger Jones, and Dr. Anibal Acosta, also a former trainee of Drs. Howard and Georgiana Jones, who joined the team from Argentina. Last but hardly least, of course, Lucinda Wieck, the all-important embryologist of the team. Job number 3, at least in those days, was the imperative of securing a certificate of need for the program from the local Department of Health. Perhaps unexpectedly, this generated a battle royale between the pro-life and pro-choice constituencies of the region. The pro-life contingent was represented by Charles D. Dean Jr., president of the Tidewater chapter of the Virginia Society for Human Life. The pro-choice contingent was represented by Roy Parker, MD, then president of ACOG, Professor John Biggers from Harvard Medical School, the Reverend Heath Light, and Rabbi Lawrence Foreman. After a long and convoluted process, which we will not be discussing today, the certificate of need was finally granted and thereby allowed the program to proceed. The beginning was hardly auspicious. 41 natural IVF cycles with embryo transfer were followed by 12 HMG-stimulated IVF cycles with embryo transfer, adding up to 53 attempts, but no pregnancies. Enter Judy and Roger Carr. Judy's egg retrieval transpired on April the 21st, 1981, by laparoscopy, of course. Embryo transfer took place 6 days later. The pregnancy test turned positive on May the 7th, 1981, and Elizabeth Jordan Carr was to be delivered by cesarean section scheduled for December the 28th, 1981. Shown in the following video clip, some happy moments from that heady day.
Elizabeth Jordan Carr.
She was good? She's, that's all I want to hear. Oh boy. No, I like your hat. Hello.
Beautiful.
She's something else. Well, you don't look too thrilled with life there.
Oh, she's doing great. She really is.
Hello. She is kind of tiny though, isn't she?
She looks well nourished. You can tell by the skin, the quality of the skin, and the thickness of the skin fold.
Well, we'll let her go back to sleep. I think so. Oh, dear.
Cut this one. Cut this short.
Okay.
Drs. Howard and Georgiana Jones, shown here with Elizabeth Carr, in their inimitable way, declared Elizabeth Jordan Carr their first IVF granddaughter. On August the 11th of this year, I had the opportunity and the privilege to speak with Judy Carr. Here's what she had to say.
It is really good to see you again, Judy, and to have this opportunity to revisit what happened now 40 years ago. So thinking back to 1981, what were the circumstances that led you to seek out the Norfolk IVF program? And how did you find out about it in the first place?
Well, in 1981, unfortunately, I suffered my third ectopic pregnancy. And after that, I was speaking with the doctor, and he said, well, I don't know if this makes any sense whatsoever, but he had just returned from a conference in Williamsburg where he heard both Dr. Jones speak on IVF. And the doctor said to me, I have no idea, I don't understand anything about this, but you might be interested.
Were you aware of the fact at the time that the Norfolk program had yet to give rise to an IVF baby at that time? And if so, would that really have mattered to the extent that you can speculate on that?
I had absolutely no idea that they did not have a success. I just assumed that they had, certainly because Louise Brown had been born in England, and I knew there had been some other pregnancies, so I just assumed that this was the case for me. When my husband and I discussed it, and we didn't know, and they didn't tell us, we had decided that we had been given this opportunity to do this as a possibility. And we decided that we didn't want to be 40 years old and looking back and saying, I wish we had done this. And it wouldn't have mattered to us at all.
What do you recall of your first encounter with the Norfolk IVF team? You, after all, did not know any of the actors, did you?
Absolutely not. We were coming from Massachusetts, where this technology was still illegal to even investigate at all of the Massachusetts hospitals. The district attorney in Boston had said this was experimentation on an embryo, and that was not allowed. So we headed to Norfolk after having some phone conversations, and we walked into the Norfolk Clinic, which was at Norfolk Medical School. And the minute I opened the door and walked in, I felt incredibly comfortable and said, we're in the right place. Everyone from the reception to Dr. Garcia and the Drs. Jones, Dr. Costa, everyone we met, we knew we felt very, very comfortable.
I'm hardly surprised, but it's a memory and recollection that only you can share. What is your most vivid recollection of your Norfolk experience, if we can call it that, culminating in the eventual delivery of Elizabeth by cesarean section?
Well, I have several vivid memories. All of them were just so wonderful and such a joy at the time. But one of the things that I found remarkable, when I became pregnant with Elizabeth, Dr. Howard Jones found out that I was taking the airport limousine to the hotel and to the clinic. And after he found that out, he decided that he would become the new limousine driver. And he picked me up every time I flew into Norfolk for an appointment. And it's during that time that he and I would have conversations that we really got to understand each other. I got to understand the importance of all this, which I really didn't understand before, and more about them and the protocols and all of that. And Dr. Jones got to know more about me, and I thought that was a remarkable experience. The other experience that I obviously cannot forget before the birth of Elizabeth was the fact that my egg had fertilized and that they were transferring it on my birthday, on April 17th. Amazing.
All kinds of amazing coincidences here with critical dates.
Yes.
What might you wish to say to the physicians who make up our audience today, who are practicing IVF 40 years later as a matter of course, some of whom are probably too young to have recalled what we at least experienced in real time?
Well, it's important for doctors to know, and I received this information because I talk to current patients often. And one of the things that comes to mind, and I think it's very important for doctors to understand, that each patient, even though there's incredible standard protocols and there's cryopreservation and all these wonderful technologies, the doctors need to not lose sight of each individual patient, because there is room for flexibility. And as I said, each patient needs to feel like the doctor knows them. And that's that matter of rapport and trust. And if that doesn't happen, the successes probably aren't as great.
Well, very well said. And of course, spoken by somebody who has witnessed it all firsthand. Judy, I can't tell you how delighted I am that we had this opportunity, how privileged I feel to have known you and to be in a position to revisit these momentous events. Thank you very much.
Which brings us to the future of IVF, which Dr. Howard Jones addressed back in 2011 in a paper published by Fertility and Sterility titled 7 Roads Traveled Well and 7 to be Traveled More. Those amongst you who may be poetry aficionados may hear echoes of Mr. Robert Frost's most famous poem, The Road Not Taken. And you'd be right, because when Dr. Howard Jones was a college student at Amherst, Mr. Frost was his English teacher. And it is that encounter that left a lifelong impression on Dr. Jones, who repeatedly referred to that experience and used some of those themes in future discussions. Taking Dr. Jones up on that theme, I will do my very best to discuss the 7 roads to travel more, as he would put it. I'll begin with a very brief discussion of what is imminent, if not already here, the IVF lab on a chip. I will say something about the notion of the trophectoderm window and what it really means. We will then proceed to say a few words about remedial germline editing. We will cover the all-important and evolving area of in vitro gametogenesis, the stunning possibility of same-sex assisted reproduction, the somewhat unrelated but exciting evolution of ectogenesis, and we'll close with another common refrain of Dr. Howard Jones, who was referring to so-called embryos possessive of newborn potential. IVF lab on a chip, as I mentioned, is of course a fast approaching frontier which many of you are very familiar with. The notion here, of course, is to minimize to the degree possible the handling of gametes and or embryos by a human hand, possibly improve the efficiency, perhaps safety, perhaps even the quality of the process all around. That is transpiring almost as we speak. Whether or not artificial intelligence will be incorporated into this paradigm, of course, remains to be seen. I will simply say that based on my own limited interactions with artificial intelligence, about which we have written now several times, this strikes me as an ideal union and one which would dramatically benefit the process in ways we can probably not even imagine at this time. The trophectoderm window is, of course, a concept. It's all, of course, based on the notion that we are finally in a position to access the embryo at the trophectoderm layer when we are encountering a blastocyst stage embryo. And really, for the first time in human history, we have the ability to peer into the embryo, to interrogate virtually any analyte of the human embryo by means of this window into what previously was obviously unreachable. The possibilities here are endless. We are already capitalizing on this approach, of course, but there will be more so-called IVF add-ons and technologies that will capitalize on our ability to assess the embryo at this stage in its development and potentially project as to what this might mean to the future embryo as it implants, as it traverses the first trimester, and as it proceeds to term to give birth to a hopefully healthy newborn. What is important here is that we adhere to responsible innovation, which is to say that each and every technology we believe has a future, we should subject to randomized, double-blind, controlled studies, and to whatever other appropriate studies might be applicable, such that both we and the public can be completely assured that what we are offering is a quality product of real utility that is worth the effort and, in many cases, of course, the expense. This is particularly true today in the United States because we lack governmental or federal responsible regulation of so-called laboratory-developed tests, or LDTs for short. It is a peculiarity of our system that the FDA, which regulates almost anything in sight, for a variety of reasons, ended up bypassing the regulation of laboratory-developed tests, which most of the tests which we use, of course, fall into that category. So for the time being, the responsibility for regulation falls upon us. This could change, of course, and there are indications that the FDA will step in. And we have begun to look into it and potentially will say something about this at some point. But for the time being, it is up to us to ensure that the trophectoderm window is put to good use and in a responsible, innovative fashion. Remedial germline editing is almost certainly going to be part of our future. One simply cannot ignore the importance of the monogenic diseases, which are all but impossible to cure postnatally, and yet could be effectively addressed in principle at the time that the embryo is available to us. And the developments in editing, which you're all, I'm sure, familiar with, make it all possible, although perhaps not quite yet to the point of application. On September the 3rd of last year, a joint commission of the Royal Society, the National Academy of Medicine, and the National Academy of Sciences issued the latest report on heritable human genome editing. The WHO has since issued yet another report. But this particular group issued some key clinical recommendations. First, no attempt should be made to, quote, establish a pregnancy with a human embryo that has undergone genome editing, end quote, at this time. Clinical use of heritable human genome editing should proceed incrementally. Clinical use of heritable human genome editing should be limited to serious monogenic diseases. And clinical use of heritable human genome editing must guarantee impeccable editing efficiency, specificity, uniformity, as well as euploidy and appropriate embryonic development. On December the 10th of last year, the group of Dieter Egli from Columbia University published on the pages of Cell a paper describing their efforts to edit the human embryo. Amongst their conclusions was the fact that unrepaired double-strand breaks persist through embryonic mitosis and result in frequent chromosome loss, outright chromosome loss. In addition, they noted off-target effects of Cas9 that cause inserts, deletions, and chromosome loss. These observations were echoed earlier this year by Dr. Kathy Nayakan from the Crick Institute in London, who on the pages of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences published a paper titled Frequent Loss of Heterozygosity in CRISPR-Cas9 Edited Early Human Embryos. She concluded that further basic research is required to assess the safety of genome editing techniques in human embryos. Clearly then, as we speak, embryo-based, clinically reliable heritable human genome editing is unlikely in the foreseeable future, but I have no doubt that it's just a question of time. In the interim, possibly, gamete-based heritable human genome editing using cultured stem cell-derived eggs or sperm may well prove to be the preferred route forward for a number of technical reasons. Which brings us to the all-important area of in vitro gametogenesis, which will doubtlessly transform IVF as we know it. As you know, this is all about beginning with a somatic cell, converting it to an induced pluripotent stem cell, and guiding that stem cell towards a gametogenic fate, be it an egg or a sperm. So starting with the somatic cell and ending up with a gamete. Perhaps the most compelling illustration of the reconstitution in vitro of the entire cycle, in this case of the mouse female germline, was provided by Katsuhiko Hayashi from Kyushu University in Japan on the pages of Nature in a paper titled Reconstitution in vitro of the entire cycle of the mouse female germline. Beginning with embryonic stem cells or induced pluripotent stem cells that were induced to become primordial germ cell-like cells and then combined with somatic ovarian cells, that led to the creation of primary oocytes, eventually M2 oocytes as shown on the left-hand side, and upon fertilization and the creation of a blastocyst, the delivery of pups. In a word, the whole process from a somatic cell concluded with the delivery of, in this case, rodent pups. More recently, on the pages of Science, Professor Mitinori Saito from Kyoto University reported on the generation of human oogonia from induced pluripotent stem cells in vitro. He began with human primordial germ cell-like cells that were combined with xenogeneic somatic ovarian cells and allowed the process to proceed, yielding oogonia, albeit not being able to go all the way. In other words, the human sequence has not yet been taken to its logical conclusion. We have gone as far as the oogonia, but we have a way to go beyond that. It is telling that this very month, October 2021, Science magazine saw fit to publish an extensive review on mammalian in vitro gametogenesis, co-authored by Dr. Saito and Hayashi. I can also tell you that the National Academy of Medicine is planning a 2022 workshop, which is supported in part by the ASRM. The impact of IVG on IVF is likely to be substantial. This might well eliminate the need in stimulation and egg retrieval. This could well do away with gamete donation, perhaps with the exception of age dependence. This would essentially convert IVF to a laboratory procedure. It would still require endometrial preparation and embryo transfer, And it just might improve affordability and thus access. I say this with some uncertainty because we've all been there before. But we also must consider what this could mean to the future of our discipline of reproductive endocrinology and infertility. If IVF becomes an in vitro procedure, we will need to reevaluate what is our purpose, what is our future. And I strongly recommend that the leadership of the discipline consider exploring the implications of IVG, which in my mind are all but inevitable and just a question of time, as you can see from all the indications that I've tried to share with you so far. I alluded to earlier to the stunning possibility of same-sex assisted reproduction, and stunning it is, because that too is completely new to human reproduction. And when you reflect on the conventions of human reproduction and Adam and Eve and the entire human history, the notion that two fathers or two mothers could in fact be the genetic parents of a child is of course a marked and very interesting departure. This notion was first, I think, clearly articulated on the pages of Cell Stem Cells in 2018 in a paper titled Generation of Bimaternal and Bipaternal Mice from Hypomethylated Haploid Embryonic Stem Cells with Imprinting Region Deletions. Schematically, it looks like this. Using parthenogenetically derived haploid embryonic stem cells that are subjected to some selective editing of the imprinting regions that are then combined with an oocyte can give rise to bimaternal mice. By the same token, androgenetically derived haploid embryonic stem cells subjected to some editing of imprinting regions and then co-injected with sperm will give rise to bipaternal mice. When and if this is extended to human is, of course, anybody's guess, but the technology, as you can see, is here. And I would not fall off my chair, as somebody has said, if this development all of a sudden made it to the pages of Nature or Science sometime in the next few years. Ectogenesis, which in many ways is extraneous, you could say, to IVF, and it is to some degree, and it has its own complex issues, which we will not be discussing today, is nevertheless an advancing front. In particular, this last year saw a remarkable advance published on the pages of Nature by a group headed by Jacob Hanna from the Weizmann Institute, a paper titled Ex utero mouse embryogenesis from pre-gastrulation to late organogenesis. What these investigators report is that histological, molecular, and single RNA sequencing analysis confirm that ex utero cultured embryos through day 11 of gestation, which is a substantial portion of the mouse gestation, recapitulate in utero development precisely. This marks a significant departure in the generally static progression, if one can use that term, in the field of ectogenesis. It's been around for about 100 years as an idea. It's been advanced to a small degree. I wouldn't say that it's unrelated to IVF because we are dealing today, of course, with uterine transplantation. The implications here, of course, go well beyond that. But nevertheless, I think in a developing world wherein concepts evolve and notions mature, I wouldn't dismiss this out of hand, and it's entirely possible that one day these two disciplines, in one way or another, will productively merge. This is an example of a 42 somite day 6 mouse embryo that was produced using these techniques. In closure, I will just say something that I already mentioned earlier, namely Dr. Jones's hope that we could someday identify embryos possessive of newborn potential. That is to say, through a series of evaluations, biochemical and otherwise, we might be in a position to predict that this embryo might implant well, escape a miscarriage, go all the way to term, and give rise to a healthy newborn. That's a lofty goal, and it's the ectoderm window which ultimately will provide us with that insight if we, in fact, can identify such a combination of factors that would allow us to reliably predict that this embryo is possessive of newborn potential. I would say stay tuned because it's an exciting, evolving arena. Those of us who may be lucky enough to be here 10 years from now, well, we might just be in a position to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the birth of Elizabeth Jordan Carr. Thank you very much.